You're listening to Tech Talks, the TV industry podcast from Broadcast Tech Magazine. My name is Jake Bickerton and I'm the editor of Broadcast Sport and Broadcast Tech magazines. My guest on the podcast today is Ingrid Silver, partner at global law firm Reed Smith. She talks in detail about the safe return of sport and the legal and financial implications of the pandemic on sports broadcasting. Hi Ingrid, how are you?
Hi, I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Yes, all right, not too bad, bearing up. First of all, kick off with a nice broad question for you, which is, will sports production and broadcast bounce back from a pandemic?
What I think we're going to see is a gradual return and possibly a few false starts along the way, depending on whether we see some spikes in cases and so on. And I also think there's going to be a huge amount of variation across different sports. So I don't think there's going to be sort of one size fits all in terms of production, logistics, and how you manage things. A lot will depend on whether you're dealing with a team sport or an individual participant, because obviously with teams there's much greater challenges, and equally around production. You know, how do you film a football match versus, I don't know, the Tour de France or a skiing competition? I think another factor to bear in mind as sports return is the role of spectators. I think there's going to be some amazing learnings out of that and what can be done with AI. I guess as with everything to do with this pandemic and the way we interact with each other and the way we work and carry out our lives, when something is new and different, initially you sort of have the natural tendency is to reject it. And then actually you end up embracing it. And a lot of people are saying now that a lot of things have come out of this that they prefer. So there's been a lot of guidance from government around return to play in different stages, starting off with training in a distanced way,
right,
and then moving through different stages to sort of a full match, as we saw last night. It's interesting because it gives you a framework, but equally it's not prescriptive, so you have to sort of figure it out for yourself. But two interesting features of that guidance is, one, clubs and sports organizations and so on have to appoint medical officers, and they also have to appoint a COVID officer.
All right.
Who's not necessarily medically trained, but who's responsible for overseeing things. We've also seen guidance from World Rugby, which also suggests, well, actually recommends the appointment of a sort of COVID officer or manager who's either medically trained or has access to clinical advice. So what we're starting to see evolve is that there will have to be some sort of accountability and responsibility on the part of organizations. We can also see that the guidance is evolving quite rapidly, so we don't really know where we're going to land in all of this. But I think it's fair to say we will end up with a framework to allow sports to return.
Could we be looking 12 months down the line from now and everything's back to normal again? Or do you actually think there'll be longer term changes being made in the sporting arena?
In terms of the long term and whether we can expect a return to normal, a lot of that is going to depend on how spectators feel about things. So even if measures are in place to manage risk, such as tracing, etc., if spectators don't have the confidence to return to a live match or environment, then it's really not going to make a difference. So I think it's going to be sensible to have a sort of dual strategy around focusing on enhancing the broadcast experience, the interactive experience, the online experience, and investing in that. And even if we do see a complete return to so-called pre-pandemic normality, those sorts of experiences have the potential to open brand new revenue streams, experiences, reach new audiences. Certainly if you think about sport on a global basis. So I don't think there's any loss in dismissing those sort of strategies, and actually there's a massive opportunity.
I want to sort of talk a little bit about who kind of owes who what. Apparently Sky Sports has come to an agreement with the Premier League as to how much they would need to get to mitigate against some of the losses that they've had to go through during lockdown, offering subscribers their money back or put a pause on their subscription, that kind of stuff. From a point of view of broadcasters keeping fans happy and federations keeping broadcasters happy and the legal side of all that, what's
How
going
do you
on?
unpick that?
Yeah.
I don't need to tell you, it's unbelievably complex because there's so many moving parts and it's a very complex ecosystem. So there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution here. But if you try and sort of unpick what's going on, the first thing to take into consideration is that this is all governed by contractual relationships between all the different parties right through the value chain. And those contracts will each contain quite specific provisions dealing with what has happened. I don't think any lawyer has ever spent so much time dealing with force majeure clauses as the profession has over the past 3 or 4 months. So it does require an analysis of what contracts say about force majeure events and what the consequences are for each particular contract in terms of rights to terminate, rights to amend, financial consequences, etc. You also need to take into account that the law that sits in the background to all of this. So what happens if a contract doesn't have a force majeure clause, or that force majeure clause doesn't cover the scenario we're dealing with?
Right.
So the doctrine of frustration is something that many of us are dealing with for the first time since law school, and fast becoming experts in.
That's the thing, is it?
That is a thing.
Right,
so the doctrine of frustration comes into play when you can't actually perform the contract because of surrounding circumstances.
Right.
And there's also a lot of law around consumer protection, coming back to subscribers and things like that. The other important factor to take into consideration when you're trying to figure out what's happening with the money is insurance.
Yeah.
And whether you actually have insurance coverage for what's happening and who funds insurance and all that sort of thing. So as I said, lots of moving parts in terms of the legalities of it. And then you also have the commercial reality. So even if the contract says, one party can walk away or receive a certain payment or whatever, if that ends a relationship so you have nothing, or has the effect of sending the other party bust, or whatever the consequences are, that's not really going to help anyone. So, as you say, there was this agreement reached between Sky and Premier League and so on. So commercial reality is really going to be what determines a lot of outcomes here. Right. Once people have established what the actual position is in contract and at law and so on.
So do you think some of the rights deals that will come up over the next year or so for sports federations and broadcasters will probably adapt in terms of the timescale that they may have covered before and what they might cover now?
My personal view is that things are going to change a lot in that, sports rights contracts have been fairly formulaic over a long period of time, and the moving parts have been around the advent of new distribution platforms and, how you slice and dice the rights. But now we're dealing with a whole new layer of uncertainty around whether you can actually, deliver the rights. And so I think there's going to be a lot more flexibility and contingency coming into play in these contracts. So as lawyers, we're going to have to think a lot harder and draft a lot smarter. But we're also going to have to tailor commercial outcomes to particular scenarios. So, what happens if a key player can't play because they're diagnosed? Or what happens if a team is taken out? Or, what happens if there's a full lockdown? So all those different scenarios will need planning around. But I think what's also going to happen, which will be quite interesting, is people are going to think a lot harder about other things that could go wrong. So we're very focused on pandemic-related things at the moment, but we're now all doubling down on our force majeure clauses and trying to think about other things that could go wrong. So, for example, we've just seen curfews around the world in relation to Black Lives Matter riots. So, political unrest, that sort of thing. How does that affect contractual performance? What happens if there's a cyber attack? now, having lived through this pandemic experience, it will focus people's minds on the realities of what a crisis can mean.
Yeah.
And related to that, people are going to think a lot harder about the sorts of risks they can insure for. Interestingly, after the SARS epidemic, a lot of insurance policies did cover the pandemic scenario. But then there are all sorts of nuances around whether or not you require a government order. As you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, the government was really tiptoeing around issuing that order and instead advising and guiding and recommending people to stay away, which was very unhelpful.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Broadcast Tech Talks podcasts. Subscribe now and I'll see you next time.